we will have lost 21% of our in-state production capacity for gasoline. The answer was yeah, prices are going to go up. We are totally dependent on basically maritime transportation of fuels into the state. But we have no inbound pipelines. The markets, I think, are looking really closely, though, saying, all right, where's California going to source this stuff? I love California. We're the smartest state. We have some of the best people. We have some of the best technology, some of the best minds.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the California Future Society podcast. I'm your host, Jarrett Catlin, and this week I speak with Professor Michael Mische from USC all about the future of gas prices in California. It's a hot topic, and it's one that was made even hotter by Professor Mische in May when he published two papers, one of which projected that due to the closure of two major refineries in California that's scheduled to happen in the next 2 years, gas prices could climb as high as $6 or $8 a gallon. Now, there's been a lot of dispute over those numbers. Even the governor himself has weighed in. We talk about the controversy around the paper and the political response in our conversation. And regardless of how you feel about those specific projections, I think it's a really interesting conversation because it comes at an interesting time in California's trajectory. California has, for a long time, been a national leader in oil production. More recently, in the last 50 years, we have been a national and international leader in reducing greenhouse gases and trying to reduce carbon emissions, reduce smog, and we've been incredibly successful, and we've set global standards. The state legislature even recently passed a rule that no new internal combustion engine cars could be bought starting in 2035. The state is fully pushing ahead towards the goal of electrifying the state. However, transitioning from where we are today to that brighter, greener future is challenging. It comes with a lot of policy trade-offs and questions and uncertainties about how we navigate where we are today to where we are hoping to go in the future. And so I enjoyed being able to speak with Professor Mische about the state of affairs in California, what is unique about our gas markets, where we're going in the near future, and what Californians should expect. So I enjoyed the conversation. I hope you do as well. As always, subscribe wherever you're listening to this, or go to californiafuturesociety.com to subscribe as well. And with that, here's Professor Mische. Today, I'm joined with Michael Mische. I'm really excited to talk to you today. How are you doing? And to start off all my conversations, I like to ask, what's your connection to the state of California?
Doing great. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. And I think I can claim myself to be a native Californian. I was born overseas. So the first place I entered the United States was Fort Mason, San Francisco. So as a little baby, my mom carried me off the ship. And so my first place in California was San Francisco. So I do consider San Francisco my home. And of course, I've spent more than half my life in the Golden State.
Beautiful. And where's your family originally from?
All over the place.
Okay.
A little bit of California, a little bit of Pennsylvania, New England. I grew up predominantly on the East Coast. You can tell by my accent, and also was educated on the East Coast. But the first time I had the opportunity to come out to California was in the 80s, which I thought were the greatest years of my life, living in San Francisco and working for KPMG. And then also coming back in 97 to be on the faculty of the University of Southern California, which is also one of the greatest periods of my life. So blessed twice by the Golden State, at least.
So you mentioned your consulting background, and then also you've been on the faculty for, is it 25 years or so now at Marshall School?
Getting up there, yeah. 7, 28, I don't know. I got to do the math.
Yeah. Well, what type of topics have you typically focused on, and classes that you teach and things like that? What we'll talk about all the energy stuff and gas prices that in your recent paper, but over your time, your career, what type of things have you focused on?
Well, I've always taught transformation, innovation from the CEO perspective, not as the innovator, but as the person who is leading an organization or a country, and how do they moderate all the innovation type projects and investments that they do and they make in, and then management consulting. So those are the three classes that I've taught consistently for all these years.
Wonderful. Well, the main topic I wanted to dive in with you is a recent paper that you had put out that caused quite a bit of a stir on gas prices. Can you talk about that, the origins of it, and we'll get into the content so far, but just at a high level overview.
Sure. I mean, I followed this industry since 1973. So this is my academic interest, purely academic. I've done some work in the industry off and on over the last, goodness, 50 years, but not consistently as an employee or a consultant to the industry. It's purely research related. I fell in love with the economics of the industry in 1973 with the Arab-Israeli War and the oil embargo and how it hit the United States and the price increases that were associated with that. It was a phenomenal period of time. Anyway, I got really involved with that and just loved studying it forever. It's a true love affair. The work on California was I was always interested in California. The petroleum industry in the state is and was absolutely instrumental to the state. Without the petroleum industry, which began commercially here in the 1860s, you really wouldn't have the infrastructure built, the agriculture built, and a lot of things that we have in California without the petroleum industry. So I was always interested from an economic standpoint, how did that industry impact our state and what, you know, what parts of it drove us to become, literally the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world and the dominant state in the United States for economic output. So really exciting for me to look at it. And now you have tech and, we go through cycles and phases, but underneath it all is petroleum. We really can't make infrastructure without petroleum. We can't make asphalt without petroleum. We can't make concrete, can't make steel. So it becomes a really important part of our infrastructure and something I just was always excited in. For this particular study, uh, I began this study over 14 months ago. So it's about 14 months of work, beginning back in 2025, early 24, January, February period. And it was a constant stream of research, data, that brought us up to the March 16th report, which concentrated on price gouging and included the closure of one refinery. And then subsequent to that report, all of a sudden, Valero decides to close down in Northern California. So that precipitated a supplement to the first report, and that one is dated May 5th. And they both received quite a bit of attention. I wish some of my other work had received so much attention, but clearly it's received a lot of attention. And it's really interesting how people react to this. In the first instance, we looked at oil and gas industry production, consumption, all the way to branded versus non-branded, premium versus regular versus mid-range fuels, all the way back to 1972. And we were looking at the prices and how California prices differentiated from that of the rest of the country. And then, we sort of saw a beginning of this widening of differentiation. And the question was, well, why was that? And that was very, very curious to us. And then the second thing was all of these allegations of price gouging. And so we looked at refineries and we looked at refiner margins and we looked at cost of crude. We looked at wholesale prices of gasoline to the distributors from the refiners. And we found no economic evidence of refiners engaging in price gouging. I mean, there isn't any. Yeah, you can scream about it all you want and make up all the things you want to make up, but there simply is no compelling economic evidence for that. And it's not really just my study that brought that out. The California State Attorney General has studied this 7, 8, or 9 times, going back to at least 2000, and hasn't found price gouging on the part of the refiners. The Federal Reserve System studied it out of the Dallas Bank, I believe, and hasn't found price gouging on the part of the refiners. The FTC looked into it, along with, I think, one of the courts in San Diego. And unilaterally, none of us has found price gouging attributed to the refiners. Now, there was an instance of price gouging attributed to traders. That's an entirely different issue and beyond the scope of the work we did, but we found no price gouging on the part of the refiners, which is contradictory to the popular political narrative that big oil is gouging the heck out of people. Well,
Yeah.
it doesn't exist. It's not there. That proof is not there.
Well, it makes sense that it's a hot topic. I know, I mean, for my entire life, as a Southern Californian, I mean, energy and particularly gas prices are a huge issue for people, particularly as the state becomes less and less affordable and people are, just trying to get by, and the narrative of people, getting killed at the pump, KTLA or other local news sources that you watch, the gas prices, any spike in gas prices gets a lot of attention, particularly as a lot of people rely on gas powered cars to get around. So it makes sense that it's a hot topic, one that you'd want to look into. And before we dive into some of the specifics of the paper, I'm curious if you could just lay out like a 101 of why is California's gas prices different to begin with. If someone doesn't know the basics of the petroleum market, how it's structured, and some of the regulatory regime that we have in California, why in the first place is California gas more expensive than most of the rest of the country?
Yeah, happy to go over that. One is we have a special blend. So the formulation of gasoline that we burn in our cars in California is different than you would buy in Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Pennsylvania, any other place. So it's a very unique blend that's specific only to California. So that's one attribute. Secondly, we have no pipelines coming into the state. So we are totally dependent on basically maritime transportation of fuels into the state. So we have no inbound pipelines. Third, we've had a 68% reduction in refineries over the last 30 years, where at one time we had over 30, 40 refineries, I think 43. We're now down, or will be down to 7 in April, making California gasoline. So the refiners have consolidated and they've also exited the state. And that in itself is an issue. Then we have all the taxes and fees that are levied on it. So California has the highest excise tax in the country. We have cap and trade, which is extraordinarily high. We have a new low carbon fuel standard coming into play, which will increase the price of gas. And we have the underground storage tank fee, along with a new cost related to inventories for gas. So simple matter is supply is coming down. Demand has remained relatively the same, but the regulatory costs have actually gone through the roof.
And when you say the special blend, that's due to desire to reduce emissions, correct? That's kind of a special blend that.
Yeah,
Can you explain that a little more?
yeah, that's correct. So as far back as the 1940s, we saw smog in Los Angeles. At least there's historical reports for that. As old as I am, I wasn't around for that.
Even me, as young as I am, I had some smog days growing up in elementary school. Not as much as my mom reports out in the Inland Empire, but yeah, I had a couple growing up. Yeah.
No, there's no question we've had an air quality problem for almost 80 years now. But in the 60s, we attacked that. We being the state, the legislature attacked that under Governor Reagan. And so the California Air Resource Board was essentially formed, which began to systemically address tailpipe emissions and the quality of air. And without question, their work has been fantastic. I mean, they have brought down the emissions and improved the quality of air. The question that we have now is, will more legislation, which adds more cost, really improve the air by that much more? So it's kind of a point of diminishing returns, if one could argue for that. But no, there was no question we needed some significant intervention. That occurred, I think, in 66, 67. And then California began implementing standards for fuel and standards for tailpipe emissions.
Yeah, it seems like a core part of the California identity, politically at least, is leading the nation in environmental laws and rules, for better and for worse, and setting those standards that oftentimes can go national. And it seems like now, tell me if this is an unfair description, it seems like the ambition is still there, the desire to be the national leader is there, but when it comes to particularly refineries, we're in a really precarious or awkward transition point where the state has set an explicit goal of electrification and banning the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles by, is it 2035, I believe. So we're on this path towards electrification and reducing fuel usage in the spirit of California leading the nation. But that glide path of what it looks like between where we are today, and where we're going in the future seems like it could be potentially rocky. Is that a fair description?
I think it's a very, very fair description, and it will be rocky. A couple of things. The 2035 ban goes back to some legislations that were established almost 25 years ago, And then the goals, if you will, the targets for the quality and the emissions have been reset periodically. So we're at a point where I think Governor Newsom uh, had had his executive order on the ban of internal combustion engine cars, the sale of new cars by 2035. Now, from a refiner's perspective, not to mention the gas station owners, the 10,000 people, 10,000 gas stations in the state that employ 174,000 people, um, that's taking away the market. I mean, you're basically legislating the market away. And so if you're a refiner and a gas station owner operator, you're sitting around saying, well, what am I going to do with these assets? Because literally the market is going to be legislated away from me. And so where am I going to sell my product, which is only specific to California? And I have no pipelines to even ship them out of the state if I wanted to remain in business. So it's quite a dilemma right now that's been created by that. Now, President Trump has stepped in and interceded and apparently has signed the bill rolling back the ban on 2035, and I'm sure it'll go to litigation and things like that. But that's a huge hurdle. And then you have a whole litany of regulatory issues associated with refinery and oil production in the state. We have adequate reserves of our own oil here in the state. I mean, we are an oil-rich state, but we import 63% of our oil from foreign sources, including Iraq and Saudi Arabia, Ecuador, Guyana, and Brazil in particular. So we're highly dependent on these foreign sources of oil, which also use massive oil tankers, maritime transit, which contribute to greenhouse emissions, by the way. And so it's quite a dilemma that California has kind of inflicted upon itself.
So we're in this dilemma, like you were saying at the outset. We have this the Phillips 66 refinery that's closing down, and there's also the Valero. Is it up in Benicia, I believe?
Yeah. Yes.
Refinery that's going to be closing as well. And then, as part of the addendum to your paper, you're saying you came out with some projections of what prices could potentially get to, and those were kind of the eye-popping thing that got a lot of attention. And
Yeah.
can you walk us through those numbers and how you got
Sure.
to that?
Sure. Okay. From 2023 to potentially 2026, April of 26, when Valero's scheduled to shut down. In effect, they'll be shut down before then. All right. That's when the sign goes on the gate closed. We will have lost 21% of our in-state production capacity for gasoline. My predictions were about 9.6 million gallons a day of lost in-state production. The CEO
Out of how many roughly? Just to give the 20% context, losing 9 million is out of what's our total roughly? I guess
well,
five times that.
We consume about 33 million.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So on average, but remember, consumption and production, we try to keep them in balance, but they are different. Okay. So this is a significant hit. I mean, you lose 21% of your production, you got to make up for it someplace. But that was about 9.6 million. Just a few weeks ago, the CEO of PBF came out, Marathon PBF, and said, gee, we think it's more like 10.5 million gallons of gas a day. And so the question then becomes, Californians, we're not going to stop driving and reduce our consumption by 10 million gallons of gas a day. Not between now and April, not unless some catastrophic event occurs. So the question then becomes, well, how do you make up for that? Where are you going to find the gasoline, and how much is it going to cost? And so when we went into our models, and we built 25 different models for this, we said, all right, where can we most likely source this petroleum or the gasoline products? That would be probably in Asia, which would be South Korea, Japan, Singapore, China, even India, even as far away as Saudi Arabia, that have refineries that can make California compliant gas. Now, when you're buying the gasoline from those refineries, it creates a lot of secondary issues. For example, if you're buying it from China, their oil comes from Iran and Russia and Venezuela, all sanctioned countries. So it's a world economy, for petroleum. It always has been. And so secondary issues are created. So you have to transport that across the ocean, anywhere from 40 to 45 days on a major tanker. Then you have to stay offshore for drayage, and then you're finally brought into port. You can unload. So what we factored in was alternative sources for that gasoline, the price of that, the price of transporting those alternative sources to the United States. Because remember, you're buying finished gasoline. So whoever makes it is going to have their profit built into it. They're going to sell it to a distributor here in California who has to add a profit on. So as the CEO said from PBF, it's going to come at a higher cost. So the same gallon of gas made in California versus the same gallon of gas imported, chances are the imported cost is going to be higher than the in-state cost. And so we factored that in. Then we factored in the automatic increase in the state excise tax. The state excise tax goes up every July 1st. Oh, it changes every July 1st. But it's not based on California gasoline prices. That's the interesting aspect of it. The excise tax in our state is based on the California Consumer Price Index, the CPI. So if the CPI is up 3%, you can expect a 3% increase in the excise tax. Mm-hmm. So it's going to move from 59.6 cents to probably 62.3 cents on July 1st, somewhere in that range. Then you have the new legislation for inventory of gasoline storage. Legislation was passed requiring the refiners to store X amount of gallons of gas or X day supply. Well, think about it. If you're burning 30 million gallons of gas a day and you're asking them to keep 10-day supply of finished goods gasoline, that's 300 million gallons. Where are they going to put it? They don't have excess capacity for that. So somewhere they have to find it or build it. But who's going to build it? Because you're out of business in 2035. So, but we factored that in. And then we factored in the new low carbon fuel standard, which CARB had originally come out to be 47 cents. They retracted it ostensibly because of public blowback. University of Pennsylvania has it from 80 to $1.38 a gallon. We had it from 57 to 63 a gallon. And then you have cap and trade, which is a big one, 50 cents on above per gallon. And then the federal excise tax of 18 cents. Local and county taxes of about 3.07%. And then the federal excise tax of 18% and underground storage. Add it all up, you're going into the year with $1.80 in taxes and fees associated with every gallon of gas produced in California or sold in California.
And how much of that is new? Like, how does that compare to the current? That's net new, $1.80 net new, or
it's that $1.80 is today.
Okay, that's today. Got it. Okay, that's what we're currently paying when we go to the pump. Yeah.
Yes, and that's federal and state, and all taxes and fees included, about $1.80. Most of that is all California, $1.64 of California. So they're not changing. And one of the controversial points of the paper is very simple. If the price of oil went to zero, we would still have the highest cost of gasoline in the country because we have the highest taxes and regulatory costs in the country. And so I can understand where some of the politicians react negatively to that, but that's the reality. That is the math.
Yeah. Well, and tell me more about there's eye-popping figures on like the potential per gallon cost by, I think it was 2026, when if we were to experience both refineries closing at 20% reduction in capacity. How did you get to some of those numbers?
Well, we built it up through the replacement cost of gasoline, transportation rates, the switch over to the new California low carbon fuel standard, and then something called the elasticity effect, which is if the supply goes down, but demand remains relatively constant, what will happen to the price? And so we calculated that number. And then we also looked at various crude oil prices. So what would the surviving refiners in the state might buy their crude oil at. And we looked at 3 or 4 or 5 different ranges of crude oil prices. And so that's where we came up with this rather large range of 604 to 843, depending on, a lot of variables that might happen in the world. But there you go. It's at that level.
And that elasticity piece, forgive me for getting a little wonky here or nerdy, but I noticed in the paper it seemed like you were keeping demand relatively constant. But if we were to experience a spike into the $6 range, I assume that there would be some elasticity of demand, meaning that, you know, some people have to drive regardless, but there would be others who reduce their usage, reduce their consumption, given in response to those prices. I've seen some papers put it at like, you know, 0.6% or something like that of
Oh yeah,
elasticity. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, we looked at 1% reduction in consumption, up to 3% reduction in consumption.
Okay.
And then we also increased the surviving refineries in the state, the only the 7 left, uh, by 3, 5, and 10% production increases.
Mm-hmm.
And in all scenarios, even if it comes down and production goes up, we're short gasoline.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it's a mathematical set of, I mean, it's just simple stuff. We're short. The question is, where do you get it? Okay, and typically when we've gone short, we've gone to Washington State. They've been pretty good at. I mean, they can produce California gasoline, and they constantly export California gasoline to us. However, they don't have the capacity to cover what we need as a result of the shortfall of in-state production. And what I mean by that is about 53% of Washington State refinery production goes to Washington State.
Mm-hmm.
They consume it themselves. About 40% gets exported to Oregon. Oregon is almost entirely dependent on Washington State for its gasoline. And we get somewhere between 5 and 7%. So, we can't go to Washington State and say, oh, we need 4 or 5 million gallons of gasoline a day from you, because they simply don't have the capacity without either dropping their own in-state production quotas or their out-of-state allocation to Oregon. So that becomes a problem. So we have to go most likely to Asia, which creates a whole litany of other problems related to greenhouse gases. Because apparently, as the CARB chair admitted in testimony last week, they don't look at the entire effect of greenhouse gases. So if it's produced in Saudi Arabia or in China, it comes over here mythically on a boat that doesn't produce any greenhouse gases. But we all know that that's a fantasy. There are greenhouse gases produced. So the issue is the net effect of procuring this gasoline 6,000 miles away and incurring greenhouse gas emissions all the way along. Is that more desirable than producing in the state of California? And that has yet to be resolved. Surprisingly, they don't study it, and they admitted it. The second thing that was admitted by the chair of Vice Chair Gunda of the CEC was, when asked directly, are prices going up? The answer was, yeah, prices are going to go up. So, will they go up as much as, our models indicate? I don't want them to go up that much. I don't want to be right.
Yeah.
But they're going to go up. It only stands to reason that given where we're at in consumption, they're going to go up relative to demand. I mean, it's just reasonable to make that logical leap.
I saw a betting market figure that had a 70% odds of prices going above $5 by the end of the year. It's hard. I didn't know the liquidity on that specific or how many people are actually trading on it, but newfound features, technologies that you can use to bet on these types of things that are publicly available are always fun to check out. How do those comparisons of actual prices at the pump compare? Has anyone else tried to model out, hey, if we experience these 2 refinery closures, we can estimate it to be roughly at a different number?
As far as I know, I was the first to try to model it out. I know the CEC has been asking for some of the equations and some help in their modeling of it. That's yet to be resolved, whether or not we'll provide those equations to them. But as far as I know, I was the first to put that out. And again, it's not whether I was right or wrong. I don't want to be right. I don't want to see $8.50 gallon, gasoline. that hurts a lot of people. It's disproportionately harsh on lower income, working class families, and fixed income folks. So I don't want to see that. The point is, we're losing 21% of in-state production. The question is, how are you going to replace it, and how much is it going to cost?
Yeah.
It's going to cost more.
Yeah.
And if you keep adding regulations, you're only adding to the cost burden.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I know those numbers, 850 figure made a lot of headlines and got some even reactions from the governor himself. Tell me more about the political reactions. And then tell me about, I'm curious too about sharing the models with CEC, because I know that one of the critiques was that, the paper didn't include the models. And so it was hard to kind of verify some of the numbers. I'm curious both the political side of it and then also on the models, how's that been? How's your life been the last month?
Oh, it's been fine. I mean, it took a lot of criticism from the governor, which I was quite disappointed in the governor. I mean, if you had any problems or you had any questions, you could have called up. I mean, he literally could have said, "Hey, Mische, what are you doing here? I don't understand these numbers. They don't make a lot of sense to me. I disagree with you, but hey, can you come up to Sacramento and walk me through it?" I mean, if he had done that, I would have literally walked to Sacramento, flown to Sacramento, done everything I could to support those questions. And whether he agreed or disagreed after the end of that, at least he would have had the benefit of sitting down and understanding the logic that went into the paper. The second part of that is the data was all their data. I mean, most of the data came out of the CEC or the U.S. Energy Information Agency. So there's no clandestine data here. It came directly from public sources. In the paper, we provide, or I provide more appropriately, a number of exhibits that show a progression of costs. Those exhibits are itemized as to what the components are. That's a good starting point for them. Uh, but I'm not compelled under any academic standards or even professional to disclose the algorithms. The algorithms themselves are somewhat proprietary. I had intended to go up to Sacramento and work with the CEC. They had asked me to work with them, and so we sort of had this tentative agreement in place to do that. But then Governor Newsom came out with all these allegations about being on the payroll of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. Tell me about that. Yeah.
We'll get to that. And the paper doesn't have this, and the paper doesn't have that, and then he had a couple of apparently so-called journalists write a few less than desirable pieces on me. But I mean, had he not done that, I would have been in Sacramento today working with him. But unfortunately, it went the political route, and I'm not a political figure, so I'm not quite sure really what precipitated this. I mean, in my opinion, he had a temper tantrum, and it was quite childish and very unstatesmanlike. And I'm thinking, my goodness, if he reacts this badly to a professor writing a paper, what's he going to do if he's elected president and he's confronted with a real problem? So, it got me thinking along those lines. But I was disappointed in his behavior and his reaction. And
Have there been,
I think any academic should be scared to death of that reaction.
yeah.
Should be absolutely scared to death of that reaction.
Has there been any market reaction? Given I assume that something $6 to $8 a gallon would change consumer behavior in certain ways. Has there been any like market projections or pricing that in, or any other reflections of that in futures markets or things like that?
No, I haven't followed that, but I can tell you what people, because I part of this is I've been on podcasts and I've been on news and things like that, and so occasionally somebody will recognize me and go, "Oh, aren't you the gasoline professor?" Yeah, I'm the guy. Oh man, I hope you're not right. We what's really going on? Are we really losing these refineries? How did that happen? How could that happen that we lose these refineries? And I'm like, well, here are a few of the reasons. So I think in some regard, it's certainly heightened consumer awareness. The markets, I think, are looking really closely though, saying, all right, where's California going to source this stuff? Because if you source it from China, you're buying gasoline that's made with Iranian oil. You're buying gasoline that's made with Russian oil. You're buying gasoline that's made with Venezuelan oil. Okay. Those are contradictory to the policy of the United States at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
If you go to India, you're buying it predominantly with Russian oil. If you go to Japan and South Korea, that's going to be Saudi oil. What Saudi oil is fine, but because Saudi Arabia was the first or second largest source of oil imports for California for years. For years, we've been importing oil from Saudi Arabia. So um, there are these secondary concerns related to human rights, national security, which type of government do you want to support, things like that. When you start going overseas and looking for gasoline, not to mention their refining standards aren't anywhere near ours. So yeah, we have some of the finest refineries in the world sitting here in California.
Yeah.
We're ranked on what's called a Nelson score, and we know we have tight control over greenhouse emissions. You're not going to find that in China.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not even close. Or India. Yeah.
No, it's an interesting time for the state because, like you were saying at the outset, this is oil production and refineries have been a key part of the Californian identity, particularly in Southern California. It's not something that people today think about, but the first big boom in Southern California was oil production. There's still a lot in Kern County. You can still see the occasional derrick down in Signal Hill or the Long Beach area, and certainly if you look at historical photos, there's a lot of that. So, thinking about the pathway forward of a state that's transitioning away from it and what that looks like for the refiners
Well,
will be a
think
remarkable time.
think about California in terms of some of the seminal names: Doheny, Stanford,
Mm-hmm.
Crocker. The list goes on. And these were all fortunes that were built either directly or tangentially by oil. Okay, and so the fortunes of California, as we drive down the street and we see some of the names on the streets or buildings, those are all related to the California oil boom of of about 100 years. And don't forget, the California oil supplied the United States fleet during World War II. I mean, without the oil fields here, it would have been very difficult for those fleets to have all the diesel fuel and aviation fuel that they needed. So California has played a prominent role in national security in many, many ways, in particular the petroleum industry. Yeah, I mean, people will say, "Are you a petroleum advocate?" And the answer is no. I'm an advocate of good policy. I have no vested interest in any petroleum company. Unlike CalPERS, the state's largest pension fund, I don't own $1 billion of stock in ExxonMobil or some of the other petroleum companies. With respect to Saudi Arabia, it was almost hilarious accusation because the work that was done in Saudi Arabia was years ago, and it was all related to Vision 2030. And if you know anything about Saudi Vision 2030, the work that I did was all related to the diversification of the Saudi economy away from petroleum. It
Yeah.
had nothing to do with petroleum.
Yeah.
It was the antithesis of petroleum, and in the outcome of that was the big idea, if you will, was to create an innovation superhighway, which would allow Saudi investment to come to the United States very quickly to invest in industries and concepts and technologies that could be brought back to Saudi Arabia to diversify its economy and increase its employment base outside of oil. And so the work was, I mean, completely related to that. It's been proven that it's been related to that. I will say I can't release the details, but an investigation was performed, and the investigation came up exonerating any of those accusations.
Got it. Yeah. And, if you were arguing that closing refineries would hurt California gas prices, doesn't help the Saudis, even if they're, so it doesn't, the logic there doesn't make sense. But,
It's absurd.
yeah.
We're on the Saudi payroll and be going, yeah, you close the refineries and we'll
Yeah.
send you the gas you want, right?
Yeah.
And you'd probably have a bunch of people like me rowing the boats over, right?
Yeah.
To reduce greenhouse emissions. I mean, it's an absurd claim. And it was just thrown out there to distract from the quality of the research, the quality of the work. I will say that among the industry experts, including Wall Street experts, the reaction to both research papers has been just some of the best stuff we've ever seen. And so that was kind of nice to get back while I was hearing from the governor that it was, not very good.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And tell me, you mentioned good policy. So California is on this path towards decarbonization. The politics of that aren't going to change, and that's pretty popular. A lot of people feel like that's, and big oil for is not the most politically popular and won't be, I think, in the next 100 years, given the legacy of carbon emissions. And so, what does good policy look like for California's leaders managing this transition towards decarbonization? What would you like to see coming out of Sacramento?
Well, in the May 5th paper, we gave them 10 action steps to follow. And those action steps were entirely designed or intended to keep the refineries operating. And with the proviso that, we want probably some type of the 2035 move back to maybe 2045 or 2055. I mean, there's no doubt we will be out of petroleum, which is the whole reason for Saudi Arabia recognized that in 2017, 16 with their 2030 vision statement. They know that their economy will not survive solely on petroleum in 100 years. So I think we need a more realistic phase out period. Second, we need a rollback of some of these regulations, including the new low carbon fuel standard. Nobody knows how much that's going to really cost. We're all sort of, estimating the best we can, but we know it's going to increase to the price of fuel. Maybe roll that back. We have a lot of oil in state. Maybe become a little less dependent on Iraqi oil, Saudi oil, Brazilian oil, Guyana oil, which is kind of in dispute. Is it Venezuelan oil? Is it Guyana oil? All right, and maybe increase some of our own in-state production. I think that would be not a bad idea, given the fact that it would create a lot of jobs and additional income, additional revenues for the state. On the provision, on a very specific provision, what I'd like to see the legislature do is, if indeed they move in the direction of allowing in-state producers to produce more oil here, I would like to see them allow that under the following condition: whatever you produce in California stays in California. And in that, by that I mean it goes to a California refinery, it's made into California gasoline, and it's sold to California gasoline dealers. Any violation of that, you're in real trouble. And part and parcel of that, and I was accused of trying to create loopholes and all. No, is give them an investment tax credit. You have to give these refiners and producers a reason to stay in the state. If you're saying you're done by 2035, they're not going to invest in anything. And one of the things that's sort of hard for some people to really kind of understand is that a refinery is a capital intensive asset. It requires millions of dollars a year to maintain. And every 4 or 5 years, you're spending a couple of $100 million to really turn over the technology in the refinery. So if you're sitting here as a refiner, and let's say your next major $100 million, $500 million turnover investment, right, to renovate the refinery, is coming up in, say, 2030 or 2031, but you're out of business in 2035, are you going to invest? The answer is you're not. You're pulling the plug. And so we need to understand that schedule and provide the refiners with an incentive to stay in state. At the same time, give great recognition to the ambition of the clean air and some of the other initiatives that the state has on its political agenda. The question for the California taxpayer is the following: have we reached the point of diminishing returns? That is, if I increase the price of gas by another 30 cents a gallon, is it really going to improve the quality of air? Now, I understand the whole issue towards EVs, but one of the problems we have in California is, according to the Legislative Analyst Office, we pay 38% more in utility rates than any other state anyway. So you're forcing people into EVs at a higher cost, or you keep them in internal combustion engines. So that it's a really self-created dilemma, in my opinion. Not to mention that the 60 cents a gallon produces about $10 billion a year in revenue for the state. So as you're bringing gasoline consumption down, that revenue comes down. Well, now the states, it's not a new idea. They knew they had to do it 10 years ago, is to put in a mileage tax.
Yeah.
So, you'll get a tax on how many miles you drive. And you should probably take that one step further. That should be the mileage tax times the weight of your vehicle, because the weight of your vehicle is what really causes the damage to the road, right? And so if you own a 7,000 pound SUV or 7,000 pound or 5,000 pound EV, you should pay a little bit more based on the weight of that vehicle out of equity. So if you're seeking equity, I'm not advocating it, I'm advocating equity. So in fact, if you're thinking that way, it would be mileage times the weight.
Yeah, I've heard some people talk about that, and it makes sense. And I think it's a political choice that a lot of jurisdictions are going to have to deal with, because the old model of tax the gas and that funds the roads no longer works and will no longer work in a world of EVs.
Yeah, it's not going to work in a world of EVs. But I saw an interesting statistic today that EV sales are down 25% across the country.
Oh, really? I didn't see that. Yeah.
Yeah. I saw it this morning, some Wall Street report. So sales are down of EVs about 25%. California's calculation was off. I think CARB had calculated about 35% market share of EVs by 2026. We're sitting at 25%. Doubtful that it'll go to 26% or 35% by next year. Doubtful, right? So, the adoption rate, I think, is slowed of EVs. I do believe it's slowed. And so unless you're forcing the consumer into it by beating them with their wallet, I think I don't think we're going to see a radical rush to EVs in the near future.
Yeah. Well, I realize I want to be respectful of your time. I realize we're at time, and I really appreciate you talking through what will be interesting years in California, not only for gas, but also for electricity. Our grid and our energy sources are going to be a topic of conversation. It was a provocative projection. I hope that you're wrong for the sake of myself and others who pay gas, and hope to see more projections as well, so we can see, different models and how they approach it. But, for yourself, you mentioned on the outset, you've been in California for a long time, and it, gives you the way I like to end the conversations, rather, is what I should say, is what gives you hope for the future of California? What are you hoping for going forward?
Look, I love California. We're the smartest state. We have some of the best people. We have some of the best technology, some of the best minds. Look, we'll figure it out. Yeah, we'll figure it out. I mean, maybe the politicians should maybe sit on the sideline and let the experts figure it out, and the politicians take the advice of the experts rather than following an ideological framework or political dogma. But I think, in terms of, do we have the people and do we have the resources? Yeah, we're the finest state in the union. We have the greatest concentration of talent, an enlightened electorate. And so maybe the politicians should maybe just sort of sit back and say, okay, work on this and come back to us with your best ideas in 6 months, and we'll listen. So, no, I have not lost hope for California. It has been the Golden State. Maybe a little bit of the luster has worn off in the last decade or so, but it can be polished up quite nicely, and it can be the Golden State that I think people dream about, and some people like me had actually lived through some of those times.
Well, I fully agree with that sentiment, and I hope that we can polish it up in these next coming years. Professor Mische, I really appreciate your time, and thank you for speaking with me today.
Oh, it's been terrific. Anytime. Loved it.
Wow.